Hello everyone, and welcome to one more conversation on leadership and teams and culture in organizations. My name is George Bruff. I'm CEO of Arthur Leadership. We're a global consulting firm that works with organizations who do business transformation projects, culture transformation, leadership development. We're specialists in the action learning methodology. Before Arthur Leadership, I spent 15 years in the executive development group at Caliper, which is a global consulting firm, working with clients such as Johnson & Johnson and NASDAQ and other large clients, working with development of high potentials, specifically their executive high potentials in leadership programs, but specifically leadership in the virtual environment as well. I live in Brazil. I've lived in Brazil for the last 22 years, and my practice is global. My clients are global. So at least for the last 15 years, I've been working almost exclusively in a virtual environment. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the Submarine Way. And I'm going to let John and Deb introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about who they are.
I'm Deb Fortin, and I'm the president of the Submarine Way. In 2016, we did a speech at a very large conference that launched a company, launched a patent, and started the Submarine Way. We're super excited to be touching businesses and communities and universities all over and really introducing a concept that we'll talk about today. I brought John on about 3 years ago now to join our organization. He left Gallup, and his contribution has been tremendous. And I'm going to turn it over to John now.
Look, we're very much looking forward to this. John, Gregory, Vincent, if you're wondering where the Submarine Way came from, I spent 15 of my 20 years underneath the ocean on submarines, and subsequently went and became a global consultant for Gallup, and have blended my passion for human beings and the human condition with Deb's expertise to just a tiny little goal of changing the world. So we look forward to spending time with you.
Great, thank you. And it's a great book. I would wholeheartedly recommend it to everyone, not just the book, but the Submarine Way, the method that we'll get into as we talk today. But I wanted to kick off, is you guys do a lot of engagement training within organizations. And you sent me an email, which I completely loved, which is absolutely the best way to start this, saying you don't change engagement by doing engagement training, which is, I think, is a wonderful attitude for a company that does engagement training. So tell me a bit more about that. Why do you not change engagement by doing engagement training?
Well, to be honest, we do mention the word engagement in our training.
We do mention it, that's true.
Yeah.
The whole principle, whether we're working on driving engagement, and all engagement is we turned this into this big fancy thing since First Break All the Rules came out in 1999, great book. But all engagement is discretionary effort. How do you get more out of people than just enough so they don't get fired, right? And we were all horrified that only about 30% of people are engaged in the organization, and 20 years later, and hundreds of millions of dollars later, it's still the same number. Well, that's because we're approaching it wrong. We're saying, let's sit everybody down, let's tell them why engagement's important, let's show them what engagement is, and then they'll be engaged. No, they won't. You have to change mindset and you have to change behavior. So it's just like our work, George, in equity and inclusion. We talk a lot about equity and inclusion. We don't have a single program entitled equity or entitled inclusion. So the reason you don't drive engagement by doing engagement training is the same way you don't drive leadership by just doing a leadership course.
Or equity or inclusion by
Right.
doing equity or inclusion.
All of those are fundamentally mindset leading to behavioral change. So you have to get under the hood and get people, why should I change my behavior? So first comes the mindset, then the behavior. That's why you don't change engagement training by doing engagement training.
And people get excited by what they do well. And most people don't really understand that. They think that what they do well is at home. I'm a chef, I'm whatever. And those are the things that I love to do. But it's very possible to find out what you do well at work and focus on that. And people are more engaged when they do the things that they love to do, naturally. And they appreciate other people too. So when other people do things well, it drives inclusion, it drives teamwork, it drives what we call community.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it seems structural to me in organizations, because organizations are not structured to figure out or to figure out how to use what people do well, which is insane to me, because they spend so much time, energy, and money recruiting. I mean, look at these, these companies. We only recruit the top 1%, and we have this battery of tests and that battery of tests, and then they never use any of it after they've brought the person on board. It basically sits in a drawer somewhere in HR, and you get told, here are your goals. Go hit them, and here's how we want you to hit them. And it's like, well, what about all that data that you've got about how this person works together? I mean, I have a theory about organizations. The penny hasn't dropped. That all organizations are nothing more than a series of teams, short-term teams, right? And many organizations are still in that trap of trying to say, how we were in the 70s or the 60s. We've got this hierarchy, and we've got these departments, and we have these, and they're always restructuring, right? Because of course the market is moving so fast, right? What the demands are so fast that the structure can't keep up with it. I think if organizations just saw themselves as a talent pool that had to form and then disband teams according to what was needed, and then you put those teams together in terms of what are the skill sets that you need, right? So we've got 100, 1,000, 10,000 people in our talent pool. We have this particular need that has to be met. What's the combination of skills, experience, dynamics that we need? Put that team together and then disband it. But instead of disbanding it means you then get rid of the people, you disband it and say, okay, what's the next team that they need to go on? And John, I'm assuming that, I've never been on a submarine, but I'm assuming that when you're out in the ocean, that's a lot of what happens. You've got the crew, and then the crew has to come together to work on specific situations, and then that little group disbands, and then you have other situations to deal with. I mean, is that off base?
No, it's actually exactly the fluidity and exactly the organic way that is completely transferable to others.
In fact, I did it in corporate America. Exactly what you said is what I did based on what my mission was, what my goal was. I would pull together teams, disband them, and people were always asking me, I'll let you get to it in a second.
It's all good.
People were always asking me, I chaired a project where we made $65 million for an organization, and they came to me and said, how were you successful? And it was all based on what you said. It was pulling together the right people, holding those individuals accountable to the goal. It works. It works. So, submarine.
I think one of the most powerful examples of exactly what you said, George, and this is absolute proof. Submarines are not like the movies, right? We don't all hang around. We're all pals. We're all buddies. Most of us don't even like each other. That's the reality, but we all love each other because we need each other. And if you think about a submarine, it's the most sophisticated vessel like ever created. I mean, it's more sophisticated than the International Space Station, and it's run by a bunch of 20-year-olds with high school diplomas. These are literally people most organizations wouldn't let them cash out the register at the end of the day. How is that done? Because we tap into what people are good at. And people like to do things that they're good at, and it's exactly what you just explained. Nobody gets up in the morning on a submarine and knows exactly how their day's going to go, because it never goes that way. So you just handle it, and it's very organic. And therefore, you become the most agile and resilient. Great buzzwords, right? Oh, we'll teach you how to be an agile resilient. By the way, you don't get there by doing agility and resilience training. But anyway, it's exactly what you said. People look at a problem and say, okay, I need George, I need Deb, and I need John on that project because they're expertise, but you have to actually know their expertise. Bring them together. They're doing what they love. Problem fixed. What's next? It's a very fluid and a much better way, as to your point. We'll build this massive structure, which will be applicable for about a year to 18 months, and then they have to reinvent their organization because things are moving too fast. So it's exactly what you're talking about.
And I would take it a step further, that even when organizations do that, they typically look at functional expertise. Oh, this guy's great in marketing. Oh, this woman's really good at HR. It's like, well, and here's my bias, right? Thanks to the internet, there is no functional knowledge that's particularly useful. Because I can go online and get any functional knowledge within 5 minutes, right? Seriously, most up to date. I can tap into any, but here's what makes it, I cannot get the rest of the stuff that you bring. Whatever's in your head, you know, from your experience on a submarine, I can get online, right? But what I can't get is your ability to come up with ideas, your ability to shoot holes in ideas, your ability to structure things, your ability to see things through. Those unique abilities that every human being has. And organizations don't spend enough time, in my experience, figuring out those things. So when I'm putting together a team, I don't particularly care about the functional expertise, because I can tap into that. That's easy, right? We can get that. But what I care about is, does everybody know the team dynamic roles that they have to play? Does everyone know who's the person who lightens the mood when the mood needs lightened? Who's the person who can come up with the ideas when we need ideas? Who's the person who can say, we've got too many ideas, we need to move on to action? And it's not that you only have that one role, but those are the roles that make a difference, right? In terms of the end result. And the other thing I thought was incredible in the book, lots of great stuff, but correct me if I'm wrong, every crew member rotates out of a submarine within 3 years, right?
Yes.
Now, the submarine has to keep going, right? It's got its mission, right? Now, if you compare that with Fortune 500 companies, 4 in every 10 Fortune 500 companies will fall out of the Fortune 500 within 10 years. Why? Because they don't have that culture. You know, a leader comes in and he or she does a great job, and they have a really good return on investment. The EBITDA is great, all of that. They're in the Fortune 500. That leader goes away in 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and there's no underlying culture to support it, so they drop out of the Fortune 500. So talk a bit more about how do you create that culture where everybody's valued, everyone has a part to play, but it's not dependent on that one person or any one person in the culture.
Yeah, that's really an excellent question.
And it's really when Deb, it was so funny when Deb came to me, and this all started with the keynote speech, and Deb said, I want you to talk about inclusion and how people are valued and included on submarines. And basically this was for a conference. It's for a diversity and inclusion conference. And I went, I don't know what you're talking about, because here we go. We never did diversity and inclusion training on a submarine. Well, but then Deb said exactly your point, George. She said, okay, now I'm using my strategic corporate brain here. Every year, 100% of your company, quote unquote, goes away. I mean, not all at once, but literally every 3 years there's a complete turnover. But there's no effect on the result. That can't be by accident.
So I said, John, there has to be a system. He said, there's not a system. He said, it's completely organic. And I said, but you say it's the same thing on every boat. When boots hit the steel deck, people know what their mission is, inclusion happens, there's a system. So I interviewed John, and I interviewed some other folks that he'd worked with on submarines, including one of his commanding officers. And we unpacked what you saw in the book, which is the 5 parts of a system. We tacked on a methodology along with the system and a process to support it, to anchor the system. And that's what we're using in businesses and universities and communities and police departments all over. And that does exactly what it did on a submarine.
Yeah. And you used a word, George, that's critically important that people don't understand the power of, and that's the word role. Most of us are most of us are job oriented. Job is related to an activity, role is related to a result. When you get to a submarine and you might be 19 years old, right out of basic training, you immediately know what your role is and how it fits into the mission. And everybody is just as important. The commanding officer, absolutely, he or she's very important, but they're no more important than the person who smashes trash and cleans dishes. And that's not to make that person who washes dishes feel important. The reality is if they don't sanitize those dishes, germs it's a submarine. One person gets sick, everybody gets sick. You can wipe a crew out. So that job as a dishwasher is just as important as the commanding officer. Commanding officer ain't washing any dishes. So that mentality is established day one.
By the way, John knows that because he was a dishwasher.
I wasn't very good. I was better at cleaning decks, but it's another story for another time. But and it creates this atmosphere that nobody's too good for anything. Everybody, but there's clearly also a hierarchy. We don't expect the commanding officer to go clean the toilet, but at the same time,
what I do, it matters.
Yeah, it
what
matters.
I do contributes to the success of the mission.
So the other thing, George, which you hear all the time, well, we would do that stuff, but we're understaffed. We're understaffed. In all my years, George, I never once went to sea with the full crew. Not once. And not once did we say, we can't get underway, we don't have everybody. You figure it out. And the way you figure it out is that role mindset. We know what the mission is, we know what the role is, and you just fill it in with people that have the expertise
Well, it's
that's
also
necessary.
interdependent collaboration,
Yeah,
too.
it's interdependent collaboration.
Yeah.
So that's how you do that. So people can change over, but there's no effect on the outcome. That would destroy most organizations the way they're run, because they have a couple of key people, and as long as they're there, you're okay. But as soon as they're gone, everybody's looking around going, what do we do? Not else.
And they're all, but like you say, they're not tapping into the potential they've got. I mean, so if I'm doing a high potential program, and I've got 15, 20 senior executives at a global company, and this program would typically take 12, 15 months, right, beginning to end, because you really want to stretch them, you really want to grow them into those C-level positions. And the program typically takes 20 to 25% of their time, right? So a day and a half, a week for over a year, right? What happens every single time we get them together and tell them that, right? Day one, we tell them that, and they say it's impossible. I'm completely stretched. I can't even. I don't even have the resources I need to do my day job. How can I possibly take a day? Because they don't get away from their day job. They have to keep doing their day job. So the first thing we say to them is, well, obviously that might be true, right? And if it is true, nobody can promote you. If you're absolutely stretched, if you're out of bandwidth, if you can't take on any more, how can someone give you a bigger role? And then they usually rethink it and say, oh no, I really do want to get promoted. It's like, okay, so now you have to figure out how to do stuff differently, right? You're not going to be given more resources, right? You're not going to be given more headcount. You're not going to be given more time, and you're probably not going to be given more money. So you have to do things differently. And what's the only thing you can do differently is change the interaction between the people. Because, there is no organization in the world that doesn't rely on people to do things. I mean, you can have the best software, you can have the best strategy, you can have everything. At the end of the day, even if it's just pressing the button to start the machine, somebody has to do that, right? So the only way that you can figure out how to do more is to figure out how do you interact differently between the people. And that goes back to exactly what you guys were saying, which is, okay, what's the contribution that you make? Why is that contribution valuable? And, is it playing to someone's strengths? Because if it plays to their strengths, they're likely to do it well, right? They're likely to feel good about their contribution. They're likely to want to do more. They're likely to volunteer, all that kind of good stuff. The other thing, we don't have time to get into a conversation about communication, which I can only imagine the communication on a submarine, but it's probably very close to what a communication in a Scottish pub looks like on a Friday night.
I think that's probably
but one of the things that you talk about, which I thought was absolutely wonderful, is that problems are solved at the lowest possible level.
Absolutely.
And that when you can get to that authentic communication, where people can have the courage and the ability to be able to deal with the problem where the problem's actually happening, instead of escalating it and passing it off to mum and dad, the managers further up the line. Talk a bit more about how the importance of solving the problem at the lowest common level.
You want me? Yeah. Okay.
I think it refers directly to submarines. So
correlated to a high reliability organization, right? Which in theory is, who's the person who actually solves the problem? Well, on submarines, you would never in your wildest imagination, if there was a leaky valve, go to the chief. The chief is basically a mid-level manager. Because what the chief's going to do is go to that person who actually touches the valve and knows the valve. So you always go to that person because they're the expert. If you think about how we're raised, at some point, most of us were systematic experts in something. And then we get promoted and we move up and we move up. I always make the joke when I was navigating submarines, I was the shizzle. I was the guy. Within 3 years of not navigating, I was basically irrelevant. But I could still navigate a submarine. I just had to go to the 19-year-old to understand the equipment because I did not. So submarines are fundamentally based on the principle, not let's make people feel good, but let's go to the person who actually knows the solution to the problem. And this is something that works so well
outside of submarines. We just don't do it regularly. The best example in the world is Southwest Airlines for an organization. When Southwest Airlines has a problem with baggage handling at Midway Airline in Chicago, they don't go to the regional vice president of baggage handling. They go out on the tarmac and they say, hey, Susan, why is it taking so long? And she says, because they're rerouting us and it's crazy. Then whoever gets involved to fix it. That concept from submarines is the most powerful concept because now you really are valued. Because people are coming to you saying, why is the valve leaking and what do we need to do? So you would never run to the chief and go, ooh, Bobby's doing this or Sammy's doing this. The whole concept of running to your supervisor for, now what do I do? You just go to the person who knows. That's how we're trained.
The other analogy we always talk about is, do you have the same people at the Monday morning or the Friday morning meeting? If you have the same people, then you're not going to get the right input, and you're also not going to have an inclusive environment. Get the right people to solve that problem in the room, regardless of what level they are, because they're going to help you get to the best solution. They're going to help you get to the quickest solution. And it's a real easy way for someone in the corporate world to look at, who is in my meetings. Change it out, and change it out quickly, and you'll find a different result, we believe, from actually bringing on and including the right people in that meeting.
If the meeting's about IT, we typically take the senior person in IT, they take notes, and then they go back and they ask the people that actually know the answers, and then next week they come back to the meeting, and why don't you just bring the person who knows?
I agree with that. I think my experience is some companies are making strides in that direction. I think that's the easy hurdle for them to get over. I think there's a bigger hurdle. So I'll throw it out and see what you guys think. I think it's easy for most organizations to say, okay, we're kind of stretched and we're kind of we're a level playing field now, so with less hierarchy, and so let's bring in the person who really knows. That the biggest hurdle is in inclusion is that it's uncomfortable, right? When someone thinks and talks and solves problems and communicates and has different experiences than you. And it's the discomfort they can't get over. I think most executives can get over, okay, let's invite the analyst in, right? They'll usually see it as being some sort of magnanimous gesture, but they can get over the hierarchy thing. But what they can't get over is this person sees the world completely differently than I do. This person goes round the houses before they make a decision, or this person sees in colours, doesn't see in data. And I actually, this is a true story. I was talking to a vice president of diversity and inclusion who's brought onto a big organisation and spent the first couple of weeks going around her stakeholders, interviewing them and asking them. She gets hauled into her boss's office and gets asked ever so politely to stop doing it because her questions are making people uncomfortable. Just her questions. I mean, she wasn't even offering any solutions. All she was doing was interviewing because it is uncomfortable. And guess what, leaders? It's meant to be uncomfortable. I mean, that's how the pearls get created, right? When the sand comes in and it's the friction and it's the conflict. But it is discomfort, and as a leader, you need to lean into that discomfort. You need to learn how to feel comfortable with someone who has a completely different life experience than you, or has a completely different way of looking at things, and not to accept that they're right and you're wrong, or that you're right and they're wrong, but that they're different. And John, I'm sure on the submarine, I loved what you were saying about we don't have to like each other, but we do have to love each other.
Well, I think you may have just hit on a significant reason for one of the biggest problems we hear about in organizations, and that's people don't have a voice. They might have a seat at the table, but they don't have a voice at the table. And if that person is actually making others uncomfortable, how quickly do they shut them up and not listen to them? Probably pretty quickly. And I hadn't actually thought about it in that way because, of course, we're advocating for let them have a seat at the table, give them a voice. But what happens if their voice is different than what the norm is? Then they're likely to shut them down. So I think you hit on something that's actually very, very important. And that won't leave my problem solving in that situation. I think that has to be considered.
And that's why you need tools. I mean, if I'm working with a team, the one thing that we do is we teach them decision-making tools and facilitation tools and communication tools that allow everyone's voice to get heard. And they're easy, right? They're easy and they're free, right? I mean, you go on the internet, it's easy to pick up half a dozen decision-making tools or facilitation tools. But it breaks all of those paradigms, right? There are different ways that you can get people's voices in. I mean, a really basic one, right? If you're working with groups virtually or working with groups across culture, get people to suggest their ideas in writing, right? Because that gets, the people who are shyer feel better, or the people who have, some people like to prepare in advance if their English is their second language, So there are different ways of doing it rather than just, I'm the person who speaks loudly and fluently, so my voice gets heard, right? There are different ways that you can do it so all the voices do get heard. But I think it all starts, as we all know, it all starts with the mindset, and the mindset should be, it's meant to be uncomfortable. When it's uncomfortable, you know it's working, right? When it's uncomfortable, you know that you're getting something that you're not normally getting. You're getting a different viewpoint, and that's where the gold is. I mean, and that's the proof. I mean, the proof's in the projects that we all run that produce these great results, and people say, how on earth did you produce these results from these people? I mean, these people used to produce X, and now they're producing 4X. It's like, okay, because they're doing something differently. And it comes from that, a lot of it comes from accepting that you know everything that you know, but you don't know everything. And if you can start from that, then you'll probably get somewhere.
Yeah, it's one of our fundamental principles when we're working with organizations. They always want to put the managers in a course and the executives in a course and the frontline folks in a course. And we say, no, that's not how you do it. What you do is you take a microcosm, a cross-section of people. So when they break out into small groups, the COO might very well be with somebody who started last week. And that's how it starts. And the purpose isn't like pretend you're the COO. It's to have real conversations with people that typically wouldn't interact in a very safe environment. And pretty soon, that uncomfortable beginning starts becoming not so weird and not so uncomfortable. So one of the best ways to model that is to make sure that when you're doing training, when you're doing these things, you're talking about real-world problems. And pretty soon the COO is like, I never would have thought about that. And that other person's like, you know what, she's not nearly as scary as she looks like in the hallway. And then it starts breaking those down without going, now we're going to get to know each other and love each other. Because it doesn't work that way.
And that's what we do in our breakout sessions. We actually give them a problem to solve. Like, why would change be difficult in your organization? And then, like John said, it might be the CEO. It might be the CEO and the person who answers the phone. They're all talking about their problems in that situation, and they're all enlightened about the problem and also about the solution. And then one person reports out on that from the workshop, so everybody can hear it. It's we call it sort of a lesson under a lesson, because part of the lesson is you're solving the problem. The lesson under the lesson is I'm learning how to communicate within my organization, and I'm role modeling that to everyone.
Yeah. To go back.
It's the same as the action learning methodology. The action learning methodology that we work with works on those three levels. You're learning about yourself, you're learning about the team, and you're learning about the organization. All three of those things are happening in the same time as you're actually producing something of value.
Yeah. Correct. And it goes actually right back to sort of the loose title of you don't drive engagement by doing engagement training. You don't get people to collaborate and be interdependent with each other to go, now we're going to do a breakout exercise. And the whole purpose here is to collaborate and to be independent. It has to be much more organic than that. So you give them a real-world problem they can all relate to, and then they start talking. And they get comfortable talking, and then it carries on and it grows. But you don't get there by saying, now we're going to get to know each other better.
No one's got time for that. So, talking of time, we could happily speak for hours, and I'm sure our listeners would not enjoy it. So let's leave them with some final thoughts. I mean, if you're trying to get the most out of the people in your organization, what are the one or two things that you would suggest that would immediately change performance?
Your talent and the talent of others, right?
Right.
Yeah, it would be talent. And what I mean by that is we all have things that we do really well the first time we've ever done them. We're not wired to focus on those. We're wired to focus on the stuff we don't do all that great. An organization would make quantum strides if they made sure if it's part of your role, you have to be competent, you have to be safe. But what you're really good at is where you should spend most of your time. You should spend time in the areas that you're an A in, not the areas you're in a C in. C is good enough. If you do that and everyone else does that, and it's safe for me to tap into your A and for you to tap into my A, that's what drives an organic. So I think the one thing people can do, get out of activity mindset, get to a result mindset, and do that by using your talents and the talents of others. You can't do that if you don't know who other people are.
And that means people are operating more in a role than a job.
Yep.
And that also drives, a positive engagement from the team, because people don't want to do just one thing. That's not very satisfying. And that one thing might not be what I'm really good at. So allow people to be in a role and for them to help define what that role is. And then they become more successful in that role.
I completely agree, and I think on top of that, I would encourage the self-awareness of know what you bring to the table, know what you take off the table, get to know your people, but know that your view on your people is valid, but it's not the whole view, right? And you have to help them, you have to coach them through their self-knowledge of who they are, but also bring in the views from everyone else so that we've got as wide a possible range of views about where you can contribute, how you can contribute, and where you might be an obstacle. And then figure out, as you said, how do you put the pieces together to deliver on what you need to deliver. And I guess the final thing then would be your role as a leader is to help figure out how to help the team be successful. Right? That's your role as a leader. If the team are not successful, you are not successful as a leader. Right? So you need to figure out what's the mission, right? They need to have some stake in the mission, because people forget that a team only signs up for the mission. It's voluntary, right? I mean, you can lock 100 people in a submarine, right? It's still voluntary if they sign up for the mission, right? Because they buy into it or they don't buy into it. And there are lots of reasons why they might buy into it or not buy into it. It's the same thing with goals in an organization. You can tell your team, here are the goals, and you can say to them, well, you'll lose your job if you don't hit the goals. That might not be enough for people to buy into it. It certainly won't be enough for discretionary effort. So you need to figure out, how did they see themselves in the goal? Right? Why should they buy into the goal? And then once they've bought into the goal, it's all the pieces we've been talking about. What do they bring to the table? How can you fit the strengths together? And then get out their way. Get out their way and let them go do their job. Sounds really simple,
We're also firm believers that you have to layer professional development over that, over all of that. If you don't have leaders who are continually developing, then they're not going to be able to evolve with the situation and think in gray areas. And the people who report to them aren't either. They need professional development too, so that's key.
Yeah, and what is it? Are you developing the competencies that make a difference? Right? When people still think of professional development in terms of MBAs and academic stuff, and nothing against MBAs. I'm sure they're wonderful things, and they're nice people who have MBAs. But
like John.
those aren't the competencies that make a difference, right? So, and there's a wealth of experience or literature about the competencies that do make a difference. I mean, there's literally great bodies of work. So you have these competencies. How are you developing these competencies in your people? And how are you measuring against the competencies? And not making that an HR exercise once a year. We have to score people. No. How do people live, breathe, and measure their abilities against these competencies that we know make a difference? I think if you crack that, then everything takes care of itself.
Well, one of the things we suggested, I'm sure you saw in the book, is if you can't afford to have an organization like ours come in to do professional development, you can afford to buy a book. Rotate that book around your team and get people to read it, and then in a staff meeting, talk about what you've learned and how you can apply it. It's inexpensive. It's $18, or for a paperback book, it's $12. And you've educated a lot of people in that room about how they can apply those tools very specifically in their environment.
Yeah.
So there's no excuse, is my point.
There is no excuse. There is no excuse. Well, that was
such a wonderful conversation. Thanks. You
It
guys
was,
do such a great job, and I would wholeheartedly recommend if anyone needs help with engagement, with diversity, with inclusion, with culture, with leadership development, with team development, you know, go speak to the Submarine Way people, because they do such a wonderful job. They approach it really well. Go buy the book. I highly recommend it. And hopefully if people enjoyed this conversation and let us know that you enjoyed it, then we'll come back for round 2, 3, 4, and 5, because, you know, it'll be more, we have an awful lot more that we happily share ideas about and talk about. So thank you ever so much, guys. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us, George.
Thank you, George. This is wonderful. We appreciate it much. Take care, folks.